Back in the 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, well, actually not the 90s because by then the economy had opened up. But before that, if you wanted a car, you had three options in India. You had the Hindustan Ambassador, you had the Standard Herald, and then you had the Fiat or the Padmini. And if you were of a sporty bent of mind, you picked one of these. Welcome to the third episode of Gone But Not Forgotten, where we are going to take you through the generations of the Premier Padmini, or the Fiat as it was commonly known, because these cars were actually Fiats. They were imported to... our parents were really small. Where was I? Yeah, so these cars were Fiats. They started coming in as completely imported units and then they were localized. So they started their life as Fiats, and then when the government said that all the foreign companies have to go back to where they came from, that's when it became the Padmini. So this story actually begins with the 1100. So let's start out. So let's start with the 1100. And before I forget, don't forget to like this video, hit the bell icon to stay notified for all our videos, subscribe to the Evo India channel, and of course, if you have any Padmini memories, drop it in the comments below. Like we did with last month's Ambassador video, we are going to run you through the history of what was once India's most popular car. We start with this, the 1100 of 1955, and then run you through the 1100E of 1957. Then the Select and Super Select. In 1964 came the definitive Padmini shape, the 1100 Delight. Then the President, when it was fully indigenized, but then the President or the government got upset by the name and it was rechristened the Padmini. Premier Automobiles Limited also sold a drive-away chassis that was then converted into ambulances, police vans, and this, the Safari station wagon. We will go for a drive in that. And we will end with the last of the line, S1. We've got timestamps for all the chapters so you can skip ahead. But every story has to start at the beginning, and much like the Ambassador story started with the Landmaster, the Padmini story started with this, the Fiat 1100. This was first shown at the 1953 Geneva Motor Show, and it came to India in 1954. And it did away with the then usual body-on-frame construction for the radical new monocoque. You know what's radical even today? The doors. Both the doors are hinged on the B pillars and it opens front way. You know what other car has suicide doors today? That's right, Rolls Royces. Fiat, they were well ahead of the game. Fiat employed very tiny engineers back in the 50s, or maybe Italians in the 50s were very tiny, or maybe we are just overfed and just too fat for our own good. But all said and done, the Fiat 1100 is really tiny. This is small, very small inside. Also, back then, people were yet to discover the problems with suicide doors, where because of the aerodynamic force, the doors would actually fly open. But that wasn't so much of a problem with the 1100 because it didn't really have the power to create that force so that the doors would fly open. Now, the body, it might have been new and radical, but the engine, it wasn't new. In fact, the engine, it traced its origins back to 1937. This car has provenance. It was owned by Humayun Vyarawala, who was India's first lady photojournalist. She was a winner of the Padma Vibhushan, the second highest civilian award. And a lot of the famous photos of Nehru with Indira were actually shot by her. She owned this car till she was around 90, and then she passed it on to Carl Bott, our friend, who got it via her nephew. And when she gave away this car, she actually booked the Nano. She got a Nano in red, and then she gave it away, I think, in a week or so because it was too tall and she couldn't reach the top of it while cleaning it. Humayun published a lot of her pictures under the pen name Dalda 13, and Dalda 13 comes from the registration number of this car, DLD 13. What a cool story. Well, at least this engine had overhead valves. Unlike the Landmaster that came with a side valve engine, which was later on upgraded to the overhead valve engine, this engine displaced 1.1 liters, 1089 cc to be precise, and made 35.5 bhp. the cars had either a Weber or a Solix carburetor. This car has the Solix carburetor, and this is actually all original. The meters are original, everything. Carl, who owns this car right now, he actually takes it for quite a bit of long distance driving. So from Pune, where he's based, he's driven it through Gujarat, Madhya Pradesh, and that's why he's got a USB charger out there for his phone. And also because this car has been used and taken care of, it actually feels really light and easy to drive. The gear shift, it is not a struggle to find gears. It actually is really easy and simple. The ride quality is not bad, though at the back it's a bit bouncy, but otherwise it actually is quite comfortable to drive. You obviously drive it with one hand stuck out of the window so that you have space, but otherwise, because these Fiats were small and they were light, they were actually easy to handle. And because they were light, these drum brakes were enough to stop it. So unlike the Ambassador, which really scared the bejesus out of you whenever you had to slow down, these brakes, they do work. And this car is a 1955 model, so this is not a new car. It's got drum brakes, but it actually stops quite alright. And look at the gears. They shift really well. It actually is pretty precise. Again, nothing like the Ambassador. And you'd think 35.5 bhp would make the car dog slow, but actually the turn of speed is quite alright. It's enough. You don't really struggle for going and overtaking slow moving traffic. It's an absolute surprise. The Ambassadors, they weren't a surprise because I'd spent so much time in Ambassador, so I knew how slow and how dreadful the dynamics were. But here, this is the first time I'm driving an 1100. I haven't driven too many Padminis, to be honest, but this just feels so much nicer. So what they say about the past, that you bought a Fiat or a Padmini if you were of a sporty bent, that is true, because this does feel much nicer than the Ambassador to drive. The gearbox, it's a 4-speed gearbox, and it has synchromesh on second, third and fourth. No synchromesh on first, so you only shift into first when you're taking off. The steering, okay, there is play. This is an old car, so look at this. You do have play, but it is not dreadful. Or maybe I'm getting used to these old cars, but I'm actually really surprised by how nice and easy and undemanding the 1100 is to drive. Just look at how it shifts from third to second. Ambassadors never shifted like this. In Bombay, Pune, Maharashtra, these cars were also called the Dukkar Fiat. Dukkar means pig, and maybe they thought that the rear haunches looked somewhat like a pig's haunches, or maybe that elegant center light on this 1957 1100 that looked like a pig snout. Don't know about that, but Premier Automobiles, they really thought that those center light looked very elegant, and that's why this 1100 was called the 1100E. E for elegant. This wasn't just a new grille. The compression ratio was increased from 7:1 to 8:1, which bumped power up to 40 bhp, while the suspension was made softer at the rear and the steering geometry was altered. So it was not just the nose that was updated, but so too was the dash. Now the speedometer, this entire console is new, and it had a strip speedometer. This was different from the earlier car which had the round speedometer, though the speedometer is still in miles per hour. The steering wheel, you can't really make out here, but it was ivory colored. The lower half of the dash, this was padded. Of course, this cassette player came much later. It wasn't part of original equipment. It had armrests on the door pads. It also had a windscreen washer. And yeah, so those were the updates on this Fiat 1100E. The Dukkar tag was laid to rest with the Select in 1958, which got tail fins, something that America gifted to the rest of the world. So gone were the piggy rear haunches, and in came the definitive shape of the Padmini, well, at least from the rear. At the front, it still retained the old 1100 nose, and it had suicide doors. This here is the Super Select that was launched in 1961, and it got a slightly altered grille, side trims, quarter windows, taillight reflectors, parcel tray under the dash and indicators. But this was an in-between step because the big change would come in 1964. As for the engine, well, no change out here. There would be no change for decades. First, we must rewind back to the late 1950s, 1957 in particular, when Fiat introduced the 1200 Granluce at the Turin Motor Show. This was intended as a luxury car to replace the top spec 1100 and got an entirely new body with more expansive glass house, including a curving rear windscreen. That gave the model its name, Granluce, meaning grand light, and 1200 indicated a new 1.2-litre 55 bhp engine which India never got. When the Fiat 1200 was discontinued, the Granluce bodywork was then donated to the 1100 range. That was introduced in 1961, and in 1964, Premier Automobiles started manufacturing that same car in India under license from Fiat. And that's why these early Fiats actually have the Fiat logo on the grille. Now, this is called the 1100D, and D stood for delight. Now, if I were a corny automobile journalist, I'd talk about how the delight continued to delight the masses for decades, but I'm not. Though, truth be told, the delight actually did delight people for years, and the D continues to delight collectors. Well, okay, now I must stop. Let's go for a drive. Now, this is familiar. My mom's a Parsi, and when my grandparents lived, there were tons of these Fiats and Padminis parked, all pristine, polished, absolutely spick and span. And in fact, as kids, we would get yelled at for riding in the parking lots, not because we'd fall and break our heads, but because we'd fall and we'd break our heads over a Padmini and maybe dent the bodywork. These cars, they bring back so many memories of my childhood, of being driven around by my uncles, aunts, and all in the same Padmini but different colors, because all the Padminis and all these Fiats were the same. Now to the driving. This is the 1100D, and D did not stand for diesel back in the day. D stood for delight. So the E was elegance and the D was delight. So this actually had Fiat badges because they were made in India under license from Fiat. So Fiat badge in the front, Fiat badges in the back, Fiat on the boss of the steering wheel. And the engine, it was the same 1.1 litre engine, but the power went up to 47 bhp. Torque, 71 Newton meters. And in fact, that's the most that would ever make. After that, it actually went down because they wanted to make it a little more fuel efficient. So how different is the 1100D from the Dukkar Fiat? Now, the body was different, so you got more space, but honestly, this still is cramped by any yardstick. Forget modern yardsticks, because when I was growing up, we grew up with Ambassadors, and the Ambassadors had tons of space. The Padmini and the Fiat is really small, so I can reach out. I don't even have to stretch to reach out to the passenger door handle. Don't even have to stretch to reach out to the passenger door handle at the back. So small car, but that also meant that this was light, 895 kilos, and contemporary reports said that it could get up to 130 kilometers per hour. So was the Fiat actually quicker than the Ambassador? Well, it's a debate that has gone on for years, but recently the Autocar guys, they put out a drag race with the Ambassador and the Fiat, and shocker, the Ambassador actually got to the quarter mile mark before the Fiat. So all of y'all who bought Fiats and Padminis because that was a sporty car, well, the Ambassador was actually quicker. But honestly, the Fiat is nicer to drive. It is more nimble. The smaller size makes it more maneuverable. It actually goes around corners without rolling like a beast. The steering, it has far more precision than the Ambassador. The gear shift, it is 10 times better than what was there on the Ambassador. But it is cramped. Oh yeah, and the brakes, also much nicer. So to be honest, the Fiat and the Padminis later on were actually safer cars than the contemporary ambassadors because they would stop in time, whereas the ambassador would probably stop in the next district or the next state. I'm actually not that tall and my head is touching the roof liner. If you want to stick your head out, you have to like... In fact, it is more comfortable to stick your hand out and drive. At least you get a little more space. This car has been restored beautifully. It's been done by Russell. He got this car in like really bad shape and then he did it up all by himself. On the outside, this light blue shade looks really nice. I don't know if this is a standard paint shade, but it looks really nice. You get this body colored panel on the dash. You get a tray under the dash for, I don't know, throwing knickknacks. The seats are not too bad. It's got this nice upholstery on the doors, and these quarter glass, it actually is the air conditioning all the air conditioning actually that you got back then. The Padminis got air conditioning after the 90s, but this obviously has no air conditioning. And in those days, we didn't really need air conditioning, did we? We were happy. Those were simpler times. The ride quality actually is much better than the 1100. That is noticeable. And of course, visibility also is better because there is more of this glass area. One thing about this Fiat 1.1 litre engine, it actually sounds quite good. So it is loud, but if you compare it with the Ambassador, and that was its only contemporary rival, the Ambassador made a lot of noise. But this sound actually is a bit sporty. And all those Fiats with a leaky silencer, those sounded like sporty cars. Those sounded like motorsport cars. When we did the last Gone But Not Forgotten with the Ambassador, I was sweating away because it was a lot of work. But now it's also a little cooler, but the Fiat is easier to drive. Less effort. It shows on my face. All the holidays that I spent with my grandparents in Bombay, we travel in the back of these kaali-peelis, black and yellow taxis, which were all Fiats. Somehow Premier convinced the Maharashtra government to permit Padminis to be registered as cabs on the claim that they were spacious. Spacious? What spacious? This is the back seat of the Padmini, and even the doors, they don't open all the way, and the aperture also is very small. So then you hit your head out here, then you're hitting your head in the middle. This is a really cramped back seat. I wonder how so many of us... Oh shit. Yeah, so okay, this is COVID inappropriate behavior. Let's get out. So this is the back seat of a Padmini. Hey listen, get me that sanitizer also please. In the 60s, the government became increasingly nationalistic, throwing out foreign companies and ensuring we'd be driving the same cars for the next 3 decades. In 1973, the license agreement with Fiat ended and the 1100D was christened the President, which must have upset the President or the then government, which forced PAL to rename it the Padmini. And thus came about the Padmini, the second most iconic nameplate in India. Or if you talk to the members of all those Fiat vintage car clubs across the country, they will tell you the most iconic nameplate in India. Now, before we go for a drive in this, I must show you what has to be amongst the rarest Padminis. And that is this, the Safari. Now, Premier Automobiles never made an estate, but in the 70s and 80s, Premier sold what they called a drive-away chassis. So it had half a roof, the entire front section and all 4 doors. And then bodybuilders and big dealers were free to build their custom bodies. Starline Automobiles in Bombay, they built a police van, they built an ambulance, and they built this, the estate. So this entire rear section is actually coach built. I've never seen a Safari, let alone drive one. So more about this when I drive. To drive, nothing really changed with the Safari. Starline's owner, Deepak Chopra, he was an avid rallyist and he made a short wheelbase Padmini and he took part in, I think, the 1983 Massa rally. There are no real accounts of where he finished in that rally, so I doubt he won that rally. But they did try quite a lot of variations on the Padmini. This Safari is on the regular wheelbase, and to drive, it is no different from the other Padminis. In fact, the only real differences are down to age and the way this has been taken care of. Padminis themselves weren't really built very well, and then when they went to bodybuilders and coach builders, the build quality was even worse. Now the Safari, it didn't sell in great numbers in any case, and because of the way it was built, very few have actually stood the test of time, which is such a shame because this is such a unique shape and such an integral part of India's automotive history. I must also point out that our hatred, inexplicable hatred for estates, began in the 70s and 80s, because even then we never bought too many estates. Even though this looks really good, this does not really look like a cut paste job, to be honest. Though in terms of practicality, it actually is more hatchback than estate. And then if the cushioning is actually gone on the seat, it actually liberates a little more space. Okay, the handbrake is out here, and like the Ambassador, of course, handbrakes don't work on Padminis. The little stalks out here, those are indicators, and the other stalk is for the headlamps, and these two switches in front, that's for the park light and the beam. Nobody really asked about what revs your Padmini was pulling, unless of course you were into motorsport. Because they were small and light, Padminis were extensively used in motorsport to great success. But the most iconic Fiat to ever race in India, and also the best built, has to be this black beauty. It was built not in India but in England by Ganspeed for Vijay Mallya, and now has been brought back into running condition by Vicky Chandhok. It was built to Group 2 specifications, which was basically a free-for-all, retaining only the block and cylinder head. It got dry sump lubrication with the oil tank in the boot. The brakes were from a Chevron F2 single-seater. It had rose-jointed suspension with upper and lower arms. It had a close-ratio dog gearbox with a 2-piece prop shaft. They made a new steering system, and to connect it, they drilled a hole through the gearbox. It also got an automatic fire extinguishing system, center lock wheels, seriously, center lock wheels, a front air dam, rear spoiler, and flared wheel arches for better aero. This was without doubt the nicest looking Fiat in India, and also amongst the fastest. It raced for 2 seasons in 1983 and 84, and it was driven by Bob Fernley, the former boss of Vijay Mallya's Force India Formula 1 team. This is the Padmini from the 90s, which was slightly more modern. And by modern, I mean the ignition switch moved from the center of the dash to below the steering column. You got a molded steering wheel, which was modern. You got these indicator and wiper stalks, which were from the Maruti 800, and the dials actually changed. So the strip speedometer changed to a regular speedometer. So the speedometer is on the left. It's not a tacho, but the speedometer is on the left, and there is a quartz clock on the right, which still works. In terms of the driving, well, bad news, because Premier Automobiles actually reduced the power of this engine. So they tweaked the carb and reduced power to 42 bhp to liberate some more fuel economy. I don't know what the economy was, but this definitely does not feel as sprightly as the older cars that we've just driven. Crazy times, right, that we lived in, when an age-old engine actually went down in terms of the power instead of going up. Otherwise, in terms of the handling, the suspension, everything remained the same. Okay, this was a little nicer to your hands and your palms because this molded steering wheel was a little softer. So that was nice, but nothing else. No other differences to talk about. And this was in the 90s. So you had the 1100D in the late 60s, you had the Padmini in the 70s, then you had this deluxe models in the 90s, and all were the same. The power didn't change, the handling didn't change, nothing. It all stayed the same. That was the pace of progress at 0 miles an hour. Zero, nothing. Oh yeah, the quarter glass got knocked off, so you got a bigger window. I don't know how that really helped, because at least the quarter glass would direct some air towards you. But yeah, in the 90s, the Padmini also got air conditioning. It was not standard, it was optional, but you did get the option of air conditioning. I remember people talking about the Ambassador being very comfortable, but nobody talked about the Padmini being comfortable. Though actually now that I've driven it, and having driven a whole range of Ambassadors also for their earlier Gone But Not Forgotten episode, the Padmini ride quality is not bad. It is actually on par with Ambassador. This too has leaf springs at the back, but it actually is less bouncy at the back than the Ambassador. Go figure. Maybe it's just light, so that's why it rides and handles a little better. But this is a surprise. I always thought the Ambassadors were far more comfortable. And I also thought that the Padminis were quicker, but turns out the Ambassador is quicker. Thank you, Autocar, for the drag race. The Padmini journey would be incomplete if I did not mention the 137D. Here D stood for diesel. Bombay cabbies were dumping wheezy, smoky diesel engines smuggled into the country into their Padminis, and Premier thought, why not profit from the craze for diesels? The engine was built under license from FRN in Italy and displaced 1366cc. It made 45 bhp, but somehow it didn't do as well as the Ambassador diesels. Maybe Padmini buyers still valued the sportiness of a petrol. On a side note, the Padmini was also exported to Dubai and Egypt, and a handful of those left-hand drive versions were brought back to India, to Kerala in particular, on transfer of residence, thus saving on taxes. These left-hand drive Padminis are very rare. But the story has to come to an end somewhere, and this is where it ended, with the Padmini S1. To meet emission norms, Premier Automobiles, they sent this 1.1 litre engine to Avial in Austria, who gave it a new head. They tweaked the carburetors, gave it a new cooling system with an electric fan and also a sealed cooling system. So it used coolant and you didn't have to top up water all the time. And all put together, the power, it went up to 48 bhp. Okay, still a problem climbing steep slopes when it is wet. But power went up to 48 bhp and the top speed was quoted at 120 kilometers per hour. This engine, it also feels smoother than the other engines, and the S1s that were equipped with the floor shift, that had the gearbox from the 118NE, which actually was much nicer than this column shift. But overall, the S1 did become smoother, a little nicer to drive if you know how to drive it. So it became smoother, little nicer to drive, and this is how the Padmini ended its life. From the Fiat 1100 of 1955 to the Padmini S1 that went out of production in 2000. That's essentially the same car that was in production for 45 years and with the exact same engine that actually traced its provenance back to the 1930s. Of course, Premier Automobiles didn't only dabble with the Padmini, they actually went back to Fiat after the Padmini project and they brought in the Fiat 124. That's the car that we all know as the Lara, because Fiat also gave that car to Russia, and in India, it got a Nissan engine. And that's where the NE of 118NE comes from, NE for Nissan engine. They also partnered with Fiat to bring in the Fiat Uno, which was the first car to give Maruti Suzuki a serious fright, because the Uno, that could really take on the Zen, and bookings were through the roof, but there were a lot of labor issues and that entire project, it crumbled. They had to refund lots of deposits, they didn't refund it in time, and that created a full mess. Premier Automobiles also partnered with Peugeot to bring in the 309, but that was probably ahead of its time and didn't do too well, even though that car was really good, and the diesel engine of that car was actually used in a lot of engines, including the Zen later on. Premier Automobiles also then partnered with Fiat to bring in the Palio and the Siena, those world cars, and those took off very well. But then the constant strife and issues at the Kurla plant, eventually Fiat got tired of it. They bought over the entire stake in the joint venture. They shut the Kurla operation, sold the plant, which actually now is in prime property in Kurla in Bombay. They moved everything to Ranjangaon. And as for Premier Automobiles, they moved to Pune and they brought in the Rio. Now, the Rio was India's first Chinese car, and even though it had the 1.3 diesel engine from Fiat, the rest of the car was actually awful, and then that also got scrapped. And eventually in 2018, Premier Automobiles, they filed for bankruptcy, and that's where the story ends. that is also where our story ends. I hope you've enjoyed our run through the entire generations of the Fiat and the Padmini. And if you have any memories, drop it in the comments below. We will love to hear about it. And also, if you enjoyed this video, give us a thumbs up and share this video with like-minded enthusiasts. Remember how the Bombay cabbies sat? Hey, chala chala. Okay, we should not carry all this, huh?